It's clear that despite the appetite for reforms amongst the general population in Bahrain and amongst supporters worldwide, there is still so much work that needs to be done. So following on from Said's comments, we're now going to discuss some of the more involved measures that were implemented by the Bahraini authorities in response to the 2011 protests in order to address, or seemingly address, the fundamental grievances fueling the demonstrations. Such measures include the implementation of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, or the BISI, the National Human Rights Action Plan, as well as the creation of the National Institute for Human Rights and the introduction of ombudsmen. To provide more information on these measures, I'm delighted to introduce my colleague Falah Sayed. Falah is the Human Rights Officer at MENA Rights Group, and she worked with Alam previously on addressing the actions of such institutions. Falah, could you tell us a bit about these institutions and how effective they've actually been in practice, please?
Of course, so much, Alex, and thank you to all the viewers who are listening to us, and thank you, Sayed, for your very insightful intervention. Yeah, I mean, as was brought up, 13 years ago in February, there was a wave of protests that swept across the Arab world, and obviously Bahrainis as well took to the streets to protest structural inequalities, corruption, oppression, lack of government representation, and, amongst many other things. And in response, obviously, they were met with violence to suppress these protests. They were met with mass arrests, dozens of deaths, injuries, and so on. And in the aftermath of this mass protest, the government had to address some, international pressure regarding the mass abuses that were being committed. And so the government established the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry in June 2011 to investigate these government abuses, or seemingly, as you said, Alex, seemingly investigate the government abuses. And they implemented it by Royal Order number 28. The members of this commission were five very well-renowned international human rights experts, independent human rights experts, independent from the government. And it was tasked to determine whether the event involved violations of human rights law and eventually make recommendations that deemed appropriate. But what's important in this commission of inquiry is that beyond its investigative role, it actually had, an importance on another level, because it was going to provide a narrative around the events that were going to that happened in February 2011. And this Commission of Inquiry gave findings in November 2011. They published a report and they issued 26 recommendations to the government. They basically found that there was at least 19 individuals who were killed by authorities, that there was excessive use of force by security forces, that there was cases of torture, that thousands were arrested as well. They also, recorded that protest leaders and opposition figures were remain in prison after grossly unfair trials. So they issued these 26 recommendations after these findings, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but some of these recommendations were that to include, prompt investigation of all allegations of maltreatment, removal of the National Security Intelligence Agency from the process of domestic law enforcement, relaxation of censorship, and allowing the political opposition access to the state-controlled media. These were actually the most important recommendations that were also found by Amnesty International. So I'll let Devin as well if he wants to add anything on it. So in 2016, funnily enough, the Bahrain government announced that it has officially implemented the 26 recommendations. However, civil society organizations found that only 2 recommendations were implemented. And even, one of the commissioners, Sharif Basyouni himself, said that barely 10 recommendations have been implemented. But anyways, if we take, two of the recommendations that were implemented, one of them is actually the creation of an independent oversight body to investigate allegations of torture. This was implemented, seemingly, obviously. Bahrain has established an ombudsman office and a National Institute of Human Rights, but neither of these institutions obviously are independent nor impartial. And the staff within these bodies are often former government employees, and these bodies are actually subordinate to the Special Investigations Unit, which has obviously a history of allegations or enacting reprisals against victims who file complaints of torture. I don't want to be too long, but I just wanted to speak about the National Institution for Human Rights, which is, the official NHRI of Bahrain. It's supposed to be an institution that's independent from the government. It's supposed to be this institution that actually holds the government accountable. Unfortunately, this is not at all the reality. Even the UN Human Rights Committee actually expressed its concern about this institution, and they said that it lacks the independence to perform its functions, and it regrets the lack of information on the complaints it has received. And on that issue, Salam, as you said, Alex, Salam and MENA Rights Group have actually published a report about this institution, where we actually found that this institution has consistently failed to address several human rights abuses, including some important legislations that enables the government to commit violations. And for instance, all the legislation that were brought up by Sayed, which I'm not going to go over again, none of them ended, none of them were addressed by the National Human Rights Institution, not the criminal codes, not the press law, not the isolation law, nothing. And even though these amendments were actually brought up by the Human Rights Committee, they said that the National Institution for Human Rights should, but they never did. We also is not as effective in practice as is claimed in some of their annual reports, because actually it's overactive in addressing the complaints, and they're being selective with actually a view to avoid holding the government accountable for violation of the fundamental rights that were mentioned as well by Sayed. And they're actually even, actively involved in covering it up or whitewashing the government's image in that sense. We also found that the visits organized to the three biggest prisons in Bahrain were insufficiently documented. They lacked transparency, and clearly they failed to identify issues that have been brought to our attention by civil society and international actors. We see that this institution actually does not address anything. And just to end my speech, not wanting to go too long, but we also found that the independence of this institution is clearly compromised, considering the fact that most of the members have held positions in parliament or in government. In fact, there was sufficient information that showed that current member actually lack the necessary expertise, and basically their appointment is just used as a ladder to get a higher position in government. And basically this institution actually operates in a context of just widespread human rights violation, and just where civic spaces actually severely or not at all, severely restricted and completely non-existent.